On a cold December morning in 1997, one of Northern Ireland's most feared men, Billy Wright, stepped into what should have been a routine prison visit. But inside the supposedly secure Maze prison, enemies were waiting, armed, determined, and lethal. In an instant, Billy Wright's life came to a violent end. Had years of sectarian killings finally caught up with him? Or was there a darker force at play? A betrayal within the very walls meant to protect him? This is the story of Billy Wright, the attack that shocked a nation and the unanswered questions that still linger over who wanted him dead and why. Welcome to Crime Pulse, where we uncover the darkest criminal stories. If you're new here, hit subscribe, like, share, and tap the notification bell to follow every gripping case. Before the headlines, before the fear his name could stir, and before the paramilitary labels that would come to define him, Billy Wright was simply a boy shaped by two homes and one conflict. Born in 1960 in Wolverhampton, England, to a family whose life was about to fracture, his father, David, separated with his wife when he was still a child, leaving him with 4 sisters in a home that could no longer provide stability. Soon after, the family moved back to Northern Ireland. The upheaval left Billy and his siblings in care, separated from one another, and thrust into the heart of a society already divided by decades of sectarian tension. Billy himself was placed in a largely nationalist area of South Armagh, a Protestant boy growing up surrounded by a predominantly Catholic community. In this unfamiliar environment, he navigated friendships across the divide, mixing with Catholic children and playing Gaelic football, a sport embraced mostly by the Catholic population. Even amid this ordinary childhood, the troubles pressed close. By the 1970s, violence had become part of daily life, and the losses were not abstract statistics. Several of Billy's relatives were killed by Republican paramilitaries, a stark and personal introduction to the cost of the conflict. One death in particular left a profound mark. Jim Wright, a Salvation Army member and former Royal Ulster Constabulary reservist, was blown up by the Irish National Liberation Army in July 1977. The explosion tore through not just a man, but an entire community, leaving shock, grief, and outrage in its wake. The funeral, attended by 10,000 mourners, became a public expression of mourning and defiance, a demonstration of how deeply violence had permeated daily life. For Billy, still a teenager, the scene was unforgettable, a vivid lesson in the fragility of life, the permanence of loss, and the bitter reality of a world where neighbors could become enemies overnight. This environment shaped him. He learned early about loyalty, fear, and the weight of community allegiances. By adolescence, the escalating violence around him, combined with personal loss and responsibility, had left an indelible impression. A boy raised between worlds, Protestant by birth, but immersed in a nationalist community. Billy Wright's formative years were defined by instability, observation, and the quiet sharpening of instincts that would later guide him through darker paths. By the mid-1970s, the violence that had marked Billy Wright's adolescence began to press directly upon his own life. In 1976, not long after the Kingsmill massacre claimed the lives of 10 Protestant workers, 15-year-old Wright took his first definitive step into the world that would define him. He joined the youth wing of the Ulster Volunteer Force. For a boy still learning the boundaries of survival, the organization offered identity, structure, and purpose in a world fractured by sectarian conflict. Not long after, Wright faced his first brush with the law. Arrested for hijacking and possession of firearms, he was sentenced to 6 years in Borstal, in County Down. The experience was formative. It introduced him to hardened Loyalist figures, taught him the consequences of defiance, and instilled an understanding that reputation, both feared and respected, was as vital as loyalty or skill. He served just over half his sentence, leaving in 1980 with a sharper sense of both the dangers and opportunities that life in mid-Ulster could offer. Upon release, Wright returned to Portadown, attempting a semblance of normalcy. He married and had 2 daughters, working as an insurance salesman and at times claiming a devotion to Christianity, preaching as a born-again believer. Yet beneath the veneer of domestic life, the pull of the Loyalist networks was irresistible. Northern Ireland in the early 1980s remained a cauldron of violence, and Wright's name began to circulate quietly but steadily in the Ulster Volunteer Force's Mid-Ulster Brigade. Throughout the 1980s, Wright was arrested multiple times for minor offences, assaults, weapons possession, and other acts of intimidation. Yet convictions remained sparse. What mattered more than the courts were the alliances he forged, the reputation he cultivated, and the control he began to exert over local loyalist circles. By the late 1980s, Wright's influence was undeniable. He had earned a reputation for ruthlessness, precision, and a willingness to act decisively, traits that would later mark him as one of the most feared loyalist figures in Northern Ireland. As the 1990s approached, Wright rose to command the Mid-Ulster Brigade, a unit of the Ulster Volunteer Force responsible for a series of brutal sectarian killings. While he was never formally convicted of murder, intelligence and community accounts linked him to dozens of attacks, drive-by shootings, targeted assassinations, and bombings. The boy who had once navigated Catholic neighborhoods in South Armagh had become a man commanding fear across both sides of the divide, navigating a world in which power, loyalty, and violence were inseparable. By the end of the decade, Wright was no longer just a participant in the conflict, he was a force shaping it. His influence extended beyond Portadown, his decisions rippling through loyalist networks, and his reputation as King Rat, a nickname coined by journalists, cemented his place in the public imagination. What had begun as a teenage response to instability and personal loss had evolved into a career built on control, intimidation, and a ruthless understanding of the trouble's human cost. By the mid-1990s, Billy Wright's name carried a weight far beyond the streets of Portadown. As commander of the Mid-Ulster Brigade of the Ulster Volunteer Force, he had cultivated a reputation for precision, ruthlessness, and an unflinching willingness to act when others hesitated. Under his watch, the unit carried out a series of sectarian killings, from drive-by shootings to targeted assassinations, each act reinforcing the fear his name inspired. Yet the world around him was changing. The peace process was gaining momentum. Ceasefires were announced, negotiations quietly progressed, and leaders from across Northern Ireland sought to chart a course toward compromise. To Wright, these efforts were signs of weakness. Concessions to Republicans were betrayals in his eyes, dangerous signals that loyalist communities would be left exposed. Within the Ulster Volunteer Force, tension simmered between those willing to cooperate with political progress and the hardliners who, like Wright, viewed compromise as unacceptable. The Drumcree dispute in July 1996 crystallized that tension. The Orange Order's annual march along the Garvaghy Road had inflamed the area, and the standoff presented Wright with an opportunity to assert his authority and his vision. Amid the unrest, his men murdered Michael McGoldrick, a Catholic taxi driver. The killing, reportedly carried out as a birthday gift for Wright, was both a statement and a provocation, a brutal reminder that he would act on his own terms. The Ulster Volunteer Force leadership saw the act as reckless and destabilizing, a threat to ceasefire commitments and to the delicate negotiations taking shape across Northern Ireland. When the Ulster Volunteer Force expelled Wright, ordering him to stand down and leave Northern Ireland, it should have been the end of his influence. But Wright had cultivated something deeper than loyalty to an organization. He commanded respect, fear, and devotion from his men. Rather than submit, he turned his expulsion into an opportunity. Out of the rupture, he formed the Loyalist Volunteer Force, a paramilitary unit, loyal not to tradition or hierarchy, but to him alone. The Loyalist Volunteer Force quickly became a force defined by both violence and spectacle. Thousands attended a rally in Portadown, where Wright denounced political concessions and proclaimed the Loyalist Volunteer Force's unwavering opposition to republicanism. The unit carried out a string of sectarian killings, each one reinforcing Wright's reputation as a man who would act decisively and without compromise. In his eyes, violence was not chaos, it was control, a language the streets and the wider Loyalist community understood all too well. By the end of the decade, Wright's break with the Ulster Volunteer Force marked a turning point in Northern Ireland's Loyalist paramilitary landscape. He had become both a symbol and a strategist, a man shaped by loss and conflict, hardened by years of violence, and determined to impose his vision on a society desperately trying to move toward peace. Billy Wright's influence had evolved from a local enforcer to a figure whose reach extended across Mid-Ulster and beyond. Under his command, the Ulster Volunteer Force's Mid-Ulster Brigade had already made its mark through acts of brutal sectarian violence, but the creation of the Loyalist Volunteer Force allowed him to operate without compromise or oversight. The Loyalist Volunteer Force was a manifestation of Wright's vision, a paramilitary unit defined by loyalty to him alone and a willingness to carry out extreme measures. From 1991 onward, the bloodshed escalated. In Craigavon, 3 Catholics were murdered in the mobile shop attack, an operation tied to Wright's Mid-Ulster Brigade. In 1992, the Sean Graham Bookmakers massacre in Belfast claimed 5 lives, a chilling demonstration of precision and intimidation. 2 years later, the Lochinisland massacre left 6 people dead in a small pub as they watched the World Cup. And years later, declassified files would reveal just how much logistical support Wright's unit received, exposing the murky overlap between paramilitary networks and security forces. Each attack was a calculated message, violence as both instrument and spectacle, designed to instill fear, enforce obedience, and assert Wright's authority. Investigations and subsequent reports confirmed that many of these killings were facilitated, intentionally or otherwise, by systemic lapses, intelligence gaps, mismanaged surveillance, and occasional tip-offs allowed Wright and his men to operate with near impunity. Declassified investigations and the police ombudsman would later confirm that serving Royal Ulster constabulary officers on multiple occasions had passed intelligence to Wright's unit and shielded members from prosecution. The effect was clear. The streets of Mid-Ulster bent around him, and for those living under his shadow, law enforcement often seemed absent or complicit. After forming the Loyalist Volunteer Force in 1996, Wright's operations grew more audacious. The murder of Michael McGoldrick during the Drumcree tensions was both symbolic and public, a declaration that Wright would no longer be constrained by organizational boundaries or political considerations. By 1997, the Loyalist Volunteer Force had carried out at least a dozen more sectarian attacks, including the murder of 71-year-old John Slane and multiple drive-by shootings targeting Catholic homes and workers. Wright's name had become synonymous with unpredictability, and his men carried out orders with the certainty that disobedience would not be tolerated. Wright understood the psychological power of terror. Each killing, each drive-by, each pub shooting was designed to send a message, consolidate power, and demonstrate loyalty to the Loyalist Volunteer Force's cause. He cultivated obedience through a mixture of reward, threat, and symbolic displays of authority, reinforcing his image as a commander whose reach extended from the quiet back streets of Portadown to the wider Mid-Ulster region. Despite the deadly record, Wright's legal entanglements were limited. The conviction that ultimately landed him in prison, threatening to kill Gwen Reid, a witness to a Loyalist Volunteer Force punishment attack, was far removed from the sectarian killings for which he was widely feared. In January 1997, he was sentenced to 8 years and transferred to the Maze Prison, one of Northern Ireland's most secure facilities. Even behind bars, his presence was felt. Allegedly, he continued to guide Loyalist Volunteer Force operations externally through trusted contacts, and his reputation commanded attention from both Loyalist and Republican inmates. By the close of 1997, Wright's reign of violence had solidified. Yet the boy, who had once navigated Catholic neighborhoods in South Armagh, now faced a new, unseen vulnerability: the prison system. Within weeks, this vulnerability would be exploited in a way that shocked Northern Ireland. By late December 1997, the Maze Prison held one of Northern Ireland's most notorious figures. Billy Wright, the man whose name had inspired fear across Mid-Ulster, was confined to H Block 6. Even behind bars, his presence dominated the corridors. Loyalist and Republican prisoners alike felt the weight of his reputation, a mixture of respect, fear, and anticipation for the man who had orchestrated decades of sectarian violence. On 27th December 1997, that reputation met its ultimate test. Wright was escorted from his cell for a visit with his girlfriend, a routine procedure within the supposedly secure prison. But in an instant, opportunity turned deadly. 3 Irish National Liberation Army prisoners, armed with smuggled pistols, intercepted him in the prison van. A series of critical security lapses, including a disabled CCTV camera, an unstaffed watchtower, and a cut wire fence, created the opening the attackers needed. In moments, the man who had instilled terror across towns and streets was shot multiple times. Death came almost instantly. The immediate aftermath was tense and chaotic. Prison authorities scrambled, fellow inmates reacted with shock, and news spread rapidly beyond the walls of the maze. Wright's killing reverberated across Loyalist and Republican communities alike, leaving a mixture of relief, fear, and outrage. His funeral in Portadown drew thousands. Family, close allies, and local residents attended, many grappling with the complex emotions his life had stirred. For some, it was mourning. For others, a stark acknowledgement of the power and violence that had defined his existence. The ceremony was a reminder of how deeply Wright's actions had touched communities and how his absence would leave a void in the Loyalist paramilitary landscape. In the days and weeks that followed, the questions began to dominate public discourse. Why had Wright been housed in the same block as known enemies? How had weapons been smuggled into such a supposedly secure facility? Why were key officers absent or inactive at critical moments? Was this a tragic series of errors or something more deliberate? Allegedly, reports suggested lapses and inconsistencies, but later investigations painted a far more troubling picture. The public inquiry into his assassination, led by Derek Batchelor QC, examined every detail of the 27th of December 1997. Alan Kane, counsel for Wright's father, framed the central question: was Wright's death an unfortunate series of events or the result of deliberate collusion by authorities? The inquiry reviewed security arrangements, prison procedures, and intelligence reports, revealing systemic failures that allowed the killing to occur. Former Chief Constable Sir Hugh Ansley's remark in 1997, "It's just a question of who gets to the bastard first, us the Irish Republican Army or the Ulster Volunteer Force, you can take your pick," underscored the lethal pragmatism of the Troubles and the blurred lines between law enforcement and paramilitary violence. Billy Wright's assassination left an indelible mark on Northern Ireland's fragile peace process. At the time, tensions were extremely high, and the murder risked destabilizing both Loyalist and Republican ceasefires. Officials later reflected on the delicate balancing act required to prevent retaliatory violence while keeping negotiations alive. 4 months later, the Good Friday Agreement was signed, a historic but uneasy end to decades of conflict, a treaty signed in the shadow of blood and betrayal. Billy Wright's death did not mark the end of his story. Even absent from the streets, the imprint of his actions lingered in mid-Ulster and across Northern Ireland. The Loyalist Volunteer Force, once a formidable and feared paramilitary unit under his command, began to fragment. Without Wright's leadership, its internal cohesion faltered, rivalries surfaced, and the Loyalist Volunteer Force's influence waned. What had once been a tightly controlled organization capable of instilling terror became a patchwork of Loyalist factions, struggling to retain relevance in a society inching toward peace. Communities affected by his violence faced the long-term consequences of the terror he orchestrated. Families of victims, neighborhoods scarred by drive-by shootings, and the collective memory of sectarian killings ensured that the trauma persisted. Yet for Loyalist paramilitaries, Wright remained a symbol, simultaneously admired, feared, and vilified. For those drawn to the hidden layers of history, the stories behind the headlines, and the lessons buried in violent legacies, subscribe to Crime Pulse. Hit the notification bell to stay updated on investigative storytelling that uncovers the truths often left in the shadows.